The 1950s were a time of great prosperity and change in the United States and the world. The war was finally over and economics and the American culture were thriving. However, the fear of communism resulted to a nuclear arms race and split Europe in half. The dash to build the world's largest bomb and become a nuclear superpower led to the creation of better computing and ICBMs that would terrorize the world as we knew it. At the center of all change is politics. One such event was the election in 1952 between Eisenhower and Stevenson, with Eisenhower coming out on top. During his presidency, he created the Eisenhower Doctrine. This doctrine states that the U.S. will aid any country in the Middle East who is resisting communism. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, believed in massive retaliation and brinkmanship. These terms are in fact what the U.S. used during the Cold War against the Soviets in the Warsaw Pact. Brinkmanship is a tactic of going to the brink of war but not fully going to war. Massive retaliation is when a country says that if provoked they will use everything they have to destroy that country. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact is formed, which included the Soviet Union, China, and almost all of the eastern side of Europe. To help fight the spread of communism, the US formed a military alliance with the countries of Southeast Asia and created the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO. South Vietnam is also formed alongside of this alliance in 1955. During the 1950s, there was a major outbreak of polio and other diseases. This led to the discoveries of many different vaccines and other medicines. In 1952, scientist Jonas Salk created a new polio vaccine which extremely decreased the rate of polio in the United States. Unlike most scientists, he did not care of the financial benefits from his creation and wanted it to be accessible to everyone who needed it. Although early forms of penicillin had been available, new combinations of it created many new medicines, creating a wide array of antibiotics to fight many types of infections, thus earning the title, the miracle medicine. With the new types of technology available in the 1950s, new types of treatment including the invention of the pacemaker and the world's first artificial lung were brought about. Electric shock was also used to successfully revive a patient in cardiac arrest. While there was a warlike feel still in the air, American culture began to thrive and create a new generation of normality. The development of television created the first color TV and made it so that many American households had a television in their own home. Women still began to take jobs and leave the household after World War II and were changing the vision of what a woman could do all across the country. Although they did this, they still would not make a stand for women's rights for many years after. While there were advancements in this cultural standpoint, there was also rebellion. This new generation was known as the Beat Generation, or the Beatniks. The Beatniks were a young generation focused on change. They created rock and roll, which was based on African American jazz and blues, and shocked many older Americans. In the race to acquire the world's largest bomb, the United States was working hard to build the super, or hydrogen bomb. The bomb created a massive explosion through a fusion reaction. However, fusion reactions only occur at extremely high temperatures, so a fission reaction was used to generate the heat needed. The calculations required to make this bomb were massive and could not be completed by the mechanical calculators which existed at the time, so atomic scientists turned to calculators which used vacuum tubes. This work made great leaps to achieving the computer. The U.S. Census Bureau was also a pushing factor to develop the computer, as they wanted better ways to tabulate the data of the growing population. In 1951, the census purchased the first commercial computer. If it were not for the invention of transistors, the computers would have stayed a large, bulky contraption. So, in 1955, the world's first transistor-based computer arrived. In 1958, the integrated circuit was used to make another great leap in computing. The PDP-1 used this technology to run the world's first video game, called Space War, by the end of the decade.
With the spread of communism, the Soviets and the United States were at a nuclear arms race. Tactics such as massive retaliation and brinkmanship were used against the Soviets during this time of aggression. Though there was not any real fighting, this time was a very intense and scary time. Spies on both sides watched and stole documents from each other. In 1947, the CIA was formed to collect information and spy on foreign governments. In a summit between the United States and Soviet Union, Eisenhower proposed an open skies policy to allow collecting information on each other by air. However, the USSR denied the plan. This did not stop Eisenhower from watching over the Soviets. The US built the U-2 to collect information and photographs from very high altitudes that were thought to be out of the reach of Soviet radar. the Soviets infiltrated the US for documents on the new hydrogen bomb that they would eventually build and test. In 1953, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the USSR, died. However, communism lived on. To allow for the movement of troops and supplies in the event of a nuclear attack, Truman passed the Interstate Highway Act in 1956, which provided funding for a national highway system to be constructed. The fear of a nuclear attack was very real for American citizens, and so many wealthy families invested in personal bunkers, which were installed in the backyards of homes. Eisenhower founded NASA in 1958 so that the United States would have a space program that would outdo the Soviets. After World War II, the United States emerged as a new world power. In fact, the US had one of the most successful economic systems in the world, which was an accomplishment considering the US had just pulled out of 2 wars in the Great Depression. The baby boom, which had started shortly after World War II, still continued throughout the 1950s. With so many children came great economic advancements. While there was new technology, new households always had to have them. New kitchen appliances, TVs, washing machines, computers, and other new inventions or innovations have been a must-have. New automobile industries helped get people from home to work and other places so that they did not have to live in the middle of the city. Towns began to expand and suburbs began to flourish with population. With suburb populations increasing, new homes had to be constructed quickly and cheaply as well so that the American home buyer could afford them. One such town like this was called Levittown, New York. The houses in this neighborhood were based on a cookie-cutter strategy where all of the homes constructed were exactly the same. With every house having the same design, the cost was minimal as few supplies were wasted and workers became fluent in building them. The new interstate systems also helped contribute to the growing cities and economic growth. As men began to come home from war, certain peacetime needs had to be fulfilled. American authors became one of the highest demanding jobs. There were few authors at the time since literature was not very popular during wartime. Literature in the 1950s was very important as it showed self-satisfaction of the happy days and American values that were the 50s. Conformity was the most popular topic among the books that were made during this time. People like Ray Bradbury brought genres like science fiction to be very popular as well. During war times, women, minorities, and African Americans played huge roles. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans fought in World War II, and women and minorities took jobs to mass-produce wartime materials to drive the U.S. through the war. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, unanimously agreeing that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. The ruling paves the way for large-scale desegregation. The decision overturns the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling that sanctioned separate but equal segregation of the races, ruling that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. On December 1st of the same year, Rosa Parks sits in a white seat and is arrested for not giving up her seat to a white man. The case becomes a cause of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks' actions angered many African Americans and sprung about protests and boycotts to end discrimination. These events eventually led to actions to give women the rights they now have today. After World War II, Americans found themselves having more leisure time to enjoy sports. The invention of the television let sporting events in the United States be broadcasted to millions of people, resulting in sports reaching larger amounts of fans and an increase in support. Airline services allowed for organizations to move west and still participate. So, both the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants moved to the West Coast after the 1957 season. Because of civil rights movements, professional sports became more racially integrated during the 1950s. Jackie Robinson began the integration and played most of his career in the MLB during the 50s. Baseball was and still is a major sport in America. Teams to win the World Series during the 1950s include the New York Yankees, the New York Giants, the Milwaukee Braves, and both the Brooklyn and LA Dodgers. Players like Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle, and Yogi Berra all played in the MLB during the 50s.